Here's the part. Not only we must have perseverance, but we also must remove some things. Look at the text. You have to look at it closely. Right here in the text, in verse 19, it goes on to say this. We have this hope as an anchor for the soul, firm and secure. It enters the inner sanctuary behind the curtain where our forerunner Jesus has entered on our behalf. He has become a high priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. The inner sanctuary. It was a high priest. There was an inner sanctuary. There was this tabernacle. And in this tabernacle is where the holiest of holiest was. It was like this huge tent. And in the order of Melchizedek, there was only certain priests, only the high priest could enter into this tabernacle, could enter into this sanctuary in order to get to the holiest of holiest. And this holiest of holiest represented God's presence. Represented being able to experience and be a part of God's power and God's presence. And in this holiest of holiest, the high priest was only able to go into this place one time a year to make a sacrifice and atonement for everyone. So we had to rely, as the people had to rely on one person, one time of year to get into God's presence in order to make an atonement for everyone's sin. Now, I'm glad they didn't have to rely on me. But they had one time of year, and they had to bring out this. And also what separated this holiest of holiest was like this curtain. Can bring out my curtain? Now imagine, this curtain was huge now. So I'm going to need you all to use y'all imagination about this curtain. This curtain was much bigger than this. And this curtain represented what was behind this was the holiest of holiest. Now you couldn't come behind this. Not everybody could, right? Nobody could enter into this holiest holiest but the high priest. And only it was the high priest that could enter into this holiest of holiest. But the text says this. It says, we have this hope as an anchor for the soul that's firm and secure. And it enters the sanctuary behind the curtain. That means that God has removed this curtain that separated us from the holiest of holiest. It means that we didn't have to depend on a high priest. We didn't have to wait till one time of the year for us to get into God's presence. And God removed that. In Matthew, it talks about how the veil was ripped into two. The veil was ripped and it was separated, and it allowed all of us to get, all of us are now have the ability to get into God's presence, into the holiest of holiest, because that veil, that tent was now torn into two. And now we all have this access that we no longer had to get into the holiest of holiest. This veil was ripped into two when Christ died on the cross for our sins. The thing that separated us from God's presence was no longer there. God says that now that I've ripped this and gone behind the curtain, you now too have access to my presence. Does anybody want God's presence in your life? Does anybody want God's power and presence in your life? What the Bible is telling us in Hebrews chapter 6 is that God has now gone behind the curtain, and because of that, he's now on our behalf given us access to his power. He's given us access to his presence. Now look at this. David talks about God's presence in Psalms 37. 139, 7 through 12, it says, where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go up to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there. if I rise on the wings of the dawn, if I settle on the far side of the sea, even there your hand will guide me. Anybody wants God's hand guiding your life because you have God's presence? And it says, if I say, surely the darkness will hide me and the light become night around me, even in the darkness will not be too dark for you. That means that no matter how much of a dark place we may feel we're in, no matter what kind of dark situation we've gotten ourselves in, God's presence is available. God's power is available. Joshua 1:5 says this, no one will be able to stand against you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. And I will never leave you or forsake you. I mean, God says that, look, when you have my presence, you now have this access to my presence, and I will be with you no matter what you're going through. Just as I was with Moses, just as I was with David, I will be my power and my presence will be with you, just as it was with them, because you now have access to go into the holiest of holiest. You don't have to wait for a certain time of day. You don't have to wait for a certain time of year. You don't have to wait till you get to Sunday service. You can get into God's presence anytime, any space, any hour, right where you are, because the veil has been torn. The curtain is now giving us access to God's presence. But we had to, God, just as God had to remove the curtain, we have to remove some things as well. We have to remove some things as well. What are some of those things that we have to remove? We've placed so many things in our lives before God, and we've made them our idols. Whether it's drugs and alcohol, whether it's sex and romance, or whether it's fame and status, or whether it's money, or whether it's phones and technology, whether it's our jobs and positions and our power. We have all of these things that we begin to place in front of God. We place drugs and alcohols before God because we say, you know what, God, I'm running out of time. I don't know what else to do. So instead of me turning to you, I'm going to turn to drugs and sex and alcohol. I'm going to turn to weed because I know that this is going to help me escape the reality of what's going on. So we turn to this instead of getting to God's presence. We've turned to sex and romance because we think that just because we have this and sex and romance, that we have these things, and we got our boo thing, and we have this and that, and we place all of these things in front of God. And all of these things begin to stack up. And fame and status, more money, security bag, I need to have this. I got to have this position. I got to climb the corporate ladder. I need to be get the verified check star on my Instagram. I got to have all of this fame. I got to have all this power. And of course, we got to have the money. Money, 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 money. Money. Oh, y'all don't know the song? Y'all know the song? And so then you say, you know what? I got to have all this money. Because the everything that I need, I got to have money. Yeah, we need to have money, but what are you doing in order to get that money? What are you sacrificing in order to get that money? And we try to get all of these things. We got our phones and our phones and technology is great, but how much of your time is it consuming? And before you know it, you begin to no longer be able to get into God's presence. Because the veil is still open, right? The curtain is still open for us to get to God's presence, but then we begin to put all of these things in front of God, and we no longer have his presence in our lives. I want you to identify yourself. Where are you at on this? Have you put your job, your position, your titles in front of God? Where are you at on this? What have you placed in front of God? Approval, self-image. You're so concerned about what you look like. And we begin to put all of these things and hide ourselves because we're afraid that we don't look like the next person. We don't look like the Photoshop model that we see on TV. And we have all of these possessions and these things that we begin to place so far in front of God that we don't even see where God is in our lives, because we place all of these things in front of God. And God is saying that just as he removed the curtain, just as he tore that curtain in two, God said, I now need, the presence is available to you, but I need you to begin to remove some things from your life. What are those things that you need to remove from your life that's consuming your time, that's enabling, that is stopping you from getting to God's presence? Maybe your box looks a little differently. Maybe the thing that you have on your box isn't listed up here, but you know what that thing is. God is saying that if your thing may not be up here, something is. What have you stacked in front of God that's allowing you and preventing you from getting into God's presence to experience God's power? What is that thing? What is that thing that God is saying to you? I need you to identify, and then I need you to begin to remove it. And if you remove them one by one, you will eventually be able to get back into my presence, because my presence is still available to everyone, but you won't be able to get into it until you begin to remove some things, until you begin to tear down some things and knock them out and say, God, I don't need those things. I need your presence, God. God says that, he says there's a word that I've already gone behind the curtain, and I've gone before you. I've already ran the race. I've already gone ahead in order for you to get into my presence. I just need you to step into it. Anchor to the faithfulness of God, because you will find hope for your future. All of these things, none of these things can give us the true hope that we need for our future. All of these things that we may consider successful, all these things all of this is nothing if we don't have God's presence in our lives. And just as we started out this year with our focus fast, where we're resetting our minds, we're resetting our souls, and reminding ourselves that I don't need these things. All I need is God. It's time for all of us, each and every one of us, to find a way to get into God's presence. He's already torn the veil. He's already made the access available, that we don't require the preacher. We don't require the deacon. We don't require the high priest. All we need is God.